Hello, everyone. This is Chris Lindgren. I'm with Mass Bio. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to thank our speakers for their generosity and our co-chairs for helping plan this event. Please be sure to use the Q&A function at the bottom center of your screen. You just click on that icon and it'll open up the window where you can type. You can also use the chat to communicate with each other, but I'll remind you to, during the course of the forum to make sure you use Q&A for questions, because that's where our moderator will be looking for them. Today's moderator is Jonathan Andrus, Chief Business Officer of Clinical Inc. and Treasurer, Society of Clinical Data Management. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Great, thanks, Chris, and it's great to be with you all here this morning or this afternoon or wherever you might be in the world. It's a pleasure to be in this webinar with both Chelsea and with Amy to kind of share our thoughts and our ideas in this environment that we find ourselves in today, and really looking at the different technologies and solutions that our organizations are either looking at or looking to embrace, looking to do with our existing studies, as well as looking at what that might mean for the future. And we're really excited to be here today to share our thoughts and ideas, and also take your questions and see if we can give some thoughtful answers to those questions too, as we, even with our own organizations, are grappling with different technology ideas and how to continue to run clinical trials in light of what's going on in the world. I did put together a very brief presentation just to kind of share who each of us are. So we're going to do a round of introductions, but I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen here and pull up and minimize that. So Chris or Amy or Chelsea, if you could just confirm that the slide is showing. Great. All right. So like I said, we're all here today to talk about, clinical data certainty, really from the initial collection of the source data all the way through to submission, and looking at and addressing some data challenges that can come about with, direct collection of data and how different solutions can be applied to the world in which we find ourselves living. These are the three organizations that are here today. I mean, obviously we represent kind of our own thoughts and ideas, as well as some things that we're doing within our own organizations. But we have Prometrica, which represents kind of the CRO perspective, IRBees from the sponsor's point of view, and then Clinical Inc. from more of the vendor and technology perspective. So as we said, from a panel perspective, I am a dual-rolled person today. I am both the moderator and the panelist. And then I'm also joined with Amy Neubauer, who is Director of Data Quality Oversight at IRBees, and also Chelsea Ryan, who is Senior Manager of Clinical Trial Management at Prometrica. Amy, we'll start with you, and if you wouldn't mind just kind of giving a brief introduction of yourself, kind of your role within IRBees, and then Chelsea, you can go after that, and then I'll do a quick intro of myself as well. Amy?
Sure. Thank you. I'm Amy Neubauer. Good morning, everyone. I've worked at IRBees for about the past 5.5 years, and I've had various roles in the industry over the past 15 years. IRBees is a mid-sized biopharma. We focus primarily in CNS as well as immuno-oncology. And in my current role, I oversee clinical data management, data standards, and technical solutions efforts, supporting implementation and integration of clinical trial technologies. My team also oversees a Tier 1 help desk that administers centralized training and access management across our systems, with the goal of providing our sites with a single sign-on experience. And I've also developed and lead a clinical data sciences team, which is responsible for risk-based study execution and strategic data quality efforts for the organization.
Great, thank you. And Chelsea?
Sure. Hi, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me and Prometrica. So Prometrica is a full-service CRO. We are located in Boston. We started in 2003 as primarily data management and biostatistics, and expanded since then. As Jonathan mentioned, I'm a senior manager of clinical trial management. In that role, it's overseeing regulatory, safety, site managing, monitoring, the whole gamut. So, COVID has had a real impact on my role. I'm really looking forward to having this discussion and hearing about some strategies across the board.
Great, thanks, Chelsea. And I'm Jonathan Andrus. Although my title is Chief Business Officer, please don't let that scare you from a kind of business development perspective. I've been in industry for 24 years now. I was 2 when I joined. And prior to my time at Clinical Inc., I've been with the organization for 5 years. And in my time within the organization, I've held roles of Chief Data Officer, Chief Operating Officer, and now Chief Business Officer. And prior to that, for about 13 years, I worked for a company called BioClinica and ran all of eClinical services solutions, so data management, SaaS programming, medical coding. So bring a lot of the operational perspective to how we can apply technologies and solutions to potential and current customers. So kind of have a unique perspective on things that typically people in a role like mine wouldn't necessarily have because they traditionally come from a strictly business development background. So it's kind of the blending of both those roles to help customers, both current and potential, look at how they can apply those things. And certainly in the current environment, Clinical Inc. being an eSource provider, we have seen a huge uptick in the amount of interest in solutions like this, especially as patients have found themselves either not wanting to come into a clinical research site or office, or being a little more apprehensive than they have been in the past. So that's us. This is the panel, and of course our hosts, Chris and the rest of the MassBio team. So thank you for that. I'm going to share slides once more. I promise I won't continue to go back and forth to annoy you here on the webinar. So really our focus for today, and I just wanted to reiterate this just so it's kind of front and center for all of us to reference, is that sponsors are adopting and embracing technologies really at a speed that, if I look back in January or February of this year, of course, I was hoping that companies would kind of realize the possibilities or realize the potential that solutions and technologies that help allow for collection of data at home, allow for telehealth kinds of visits and other things to be a possibility that I would have never imagined, right? And I think, I saw a cartoon of kind of COVID-19 being this large kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of a wrecking ball that's just kind of knocked down every idea and thought we've had about clinical trials and how quickly do we need to kind of light the rocket, if you will, around moving things forward faster. So many organizations are either embracing or looking at different modalities to collect data directly within clinical trials. So really what we hope to do is talk about learning what organizations can do to help ensure the accuracy of those data. And of course, someone like Amy on the call, right, whose title itself talks about data quality and data quality oversight, I think is really important, because you can use the best possible tools you can think of, right? But if they don't yield good data quality and ensure data integrity, then it's just not meeting the mark. And of course, we want to make sure that we have compliance from the initial direct collection of data all the way to its submission. So again, just to kind of reiterate our focus for today, and then from an agenda perspective, obviously we're in the welcome and introductions, as well as kind of getting to know each of us and our roles within our respective organizations. But then I wanted to hear from each of the panelists, myself included, but we'll start with Amy and then go to Chelsea and then finish with myself about kind of what drew you or what drew them to participate in this panel, kind of weaving in some things and experiences that they're having within their own organizations and how it's kind of colored their outlook on this, as well as what they hope to be able to share today. And then the third major bullet here, questions and answers with the panelists. We really want to hear kind of from the CRO perspective, the sponsor perspective, and the vendor perspective, and we'll weave some questions into there that will help kind of draw out or facilitate those discussions. And then of course, we absolutely want to save time for participant questions, being that we only have a total of 1 hour for this. We'll be mindful of time and ensure that we stop kind of our dialogue and discussion, as well as I'll be, as Chris said, I'll be kind of moderating and looking at the Q&A as they come through. So please, please, please feel free to use that. I'll be looking at that as Amy and Chelsea are responding and providing kind of their perspectives. So that if questions come in that I think are relevant to the topic that we have at hand, I'll be sure to weave that in. So that's the plan for today. I'm gonna, again, this is the last time I'll jump back to this slide, and I'm just gonna go back to kind of our Brady Bunch view of things, and all of us here in the panel view. So as I said in the agenda, we wanna start with is just kind of, why are you, Chelsea, participating in the panel? I guess what drew you to it, kind of from your perspective within Prometrica? Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Jonathan. So I mentioned I am in a senior clinical trial manager role now. Prior to coming to Prometrica, I was in multiple technical project management roles implementing clinical systems, and then I actually started at the site. So in my role now, I kind of draw upon all of those experiences to try to think about how we can effectively and efficiently run studies, both for our sites, for our subjects, and for our sponsors, right? So making sure that we're introducing ways to make the data as clean, as high quality as we can, but also thinking about the resourcing that sites have and trying to utilize them in the best ways possible, because they really have such a source of knowledge for us that we want to tap into them as high and as quickly as possible. And then, for our sponsors, my role as a clinical trial manager and Prometrica as a CRO is to approach a protocol and really look at it and see how we can effectively run your project and get it done as quickly as possible without risking any quality or safety to your subjects along the way. So to me, eSource is a great answer to that calling, right? The FDA has said it. It eliminates unnecessary duplication of data, reduces errors, ensures accuracy and completeness. So I think, as Jonathan mentioned, COVID, has really put a wrecking ball to all of our lives in clinical research. But right now we need to come together as a research community to figure out how we can use this experience and transform it for the good for our industry. So that's really why I'm interested.
Thank you. And, when we get to the question and answer, one of the things I definitely want to hear your take on, especially because you have worked at a site, right, is to understand that dynamic, right, about these technologies and what does that mean, or what do you think it would mean having worked, at a specific site to the overall process too, because I think you have a unique perspective that I certainly have, having never worked at a site, would appreciate. So,
Great.
Amy, what brings you here today?
Sure. Well, in my role at Alchemies, I've been responsible for generally evaluating the business risks associated with use of new vendors and collecting clinical trial data. So I've also been responsible for getting any new vendor that we're taking on really up and running and integrated into our systems. And so generally I participate in audits and represent the business in those audits, describing to our cross-functional audit team how the data collection using those systems would occur and how we intend to use those systems and how we intend to maintain data quality and data privacy. We've had some sort of eSource data collection in practice in our studies since I began at Alchemies 5.5 years ago. We've used various ePro tools and eSource vendors. Everything from, informed consent, eConsent, to eSource, to tablets, to reminders sent to patients' homes. And so in light of the pandemic, what we're doing is we're focusing on how we can continue our trials and make them more decentralized so that we can continue to improve the patient experience, but also not add to the site's burden. And so not add another vendor tool to the mix that the site then has to manage and try to negotiate.
Well, good. I definitely, when we get to you, I certainly from an audit perspective, like to hear your perspective too on things that are absolutely, kind of critical, right, with systems like these. As I even mentioned at kind of the opening of this, I mean, it's one thing to use the tools, but it's another thing to make sure that they actually produce trustworthy and reliable data, right, at the end of the day. it's all, they can be kind of a flash in the pan, right? But if they don't assure that you're going to end up with data that you can trust and that's submission worthy, right? This is all about data certainty from eSource to submission, right? So it's everything along that continuum. So it'd be great to get your perspective on that when we get into the Q&A.
Sure.
And of course, I think it goes without saying, right? I mean, from a clinical link perspective, I may be slightly biased about eSource and eSource data collection tools, but I will say that the reason that kind of drew me to this webinar and this panel was because, we're also having to pivot a bit, right? It used to be that, we were doing eSource direct data capture with patients at the site. And now we're in a situation where, this was a metric that I heard IQVIA talk about, that 70% of their sites are inaccessible from a monitoring standpoint, right? Which is huge. And so it's really now looking at, okay, we offer eSource direct data capture solutions traditionally done on a tablet-based solution where I'm sitting with Amy and I'm collecting her data right there as she's in my presence. Well, now all of a sudden you have a whole set of patients that are no longer either able to come into a site because of quarantine restrictions in their given geographic location, and that site isn't really even functioning either, to looking at how to then kind of infuse and use tools like what we're using right here, right now with Zoom, right, to be able for me to have more of a telemedicine, telehealth kind of conversation like I'm having with you and Amy and Chelsea, and how to then capture those data too, and then how to use those telehealth visit data to then kind of include that with the rest of the clinical data to be able to allow for remote monitoring to be performed, right? Where I can do a Zoom meeting or a Zoom healthcare or tools like Doxy.me or other solutions that can be incorporated with that. So we've also been challenged with looking at how can we bring those together, as well as we've been asked to take, prior captured assessments that would have been done at the site, now making them available to the patient at home on their own device. So, that's been a lot of the kind of quick, fast moving things that we've had to do. And so having conversations with other folks in industry, not only the three of us, but also others here on this Mass Bio webinar, to kind of hear questions and their perspectives too, I think is what really drew me to this for sure. So, well, thanks all for your perspectives on kind of what drew you to this. So getting into some of the questions for each of you, I think from a CRO perspective, I guess one of the questions I have for you, Chelsea, is, what are you seeing happen with your current customers and kind of expectations that they have of you, the CRO, with regard to kind of monitoring, data management, just some insight there, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. I think in general, we're being asked to monitor the data closer and more frequently, more so than ever, right? Because, I mean, we've lost a lot of that connection, like you had said, Jonathan, where our monitors can't go on site right now. So we're having to come up with real creative ways that are within the guidelines and within the federal regulations to address the need to continue the research. So, I mean, a couple things that off the top of my head that, we've had to explore is, you mentioned, Jonathan, that, you've had to shift the way of thinking from e-sourcing just for subject data to also trial management data, right? So like your essential document collection. Many of our sites have e-binders, but, we've come up on the issue of that we don't have access to the e-binders because they're on a USB that's at the site and nobody can go to the site to get it when we need it. So we need to think about how can we create a way that's easy for the site to get us that information, but also is secure, that, meets Part 11, that is timely, and also that makes sure that the people that are running the trial at the site and continuing to do the work are trained and appropriately documented to be doing it. And then from a data management and just overall monitoring perspective, we as a company implement risk-based monitoring. We have for a while now, and we have KRIs, KPIs, so key performance indicators, key risk indicators that we use to measure how our projects are doing. I think risk-based monitoring is now more important than ever because really, the way that you're looking at that data on a day-to-day basis, on a month-to-month basis, you're going to see the trends quicker, and you need to be able to see them remotely. So that's been a huge tool for us. And, the way that we also are approaching our risk-based monitoring and reevaluating as we go further into this pandemic is really important too. Some of the indicators that we chose, before all of this may not be
are no longer valid.
Yeah,
Right.
and now the way that we approach that, it's a continuing conversation, and that's how risk-based monitoring always is. But I think it's important for sponsors and for CROs to understand that you should be reevaluating the way that you're looking at your data right now.
Have you had to pivot any of the tools that you're using, like to shift from the way you were collecting it before to now, like mid-study, to deploy those in order to keep enrollment going, or any perspective on that with?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we've had to shift the tools. I think it's pretty hard mid-study to shift a tool for collection. We've had conversations if that comes up. We've had conversations about having some type of a central safety lab if you didn't have that type of collection set up at the start of your trial. So what we're seeing is a lot of sites are not having patients come in for visits that aren't related to administration. So you need to come up with different ways to get those samples collected. And that could be an eSource for laboratory data. But how do you do that? You might need to set up a system to have that data get entered into it so that you can get it in real time. We've had other people come to us, or other clients, new clients come.
Well, I think we may have lost Chelsea, or she's hopefully truly not frozen.
Come to us and talk about.
Oh, there she is.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You're back now, I think.
I'm sorry about that. Can you hear me better now?
Yes. So far, for about 7 seconds you froze, but you're back.
Okay.
You've been unfrozen.
Well,
Congratulations.
I'm sorry about that. What I was just saying was really, the way that people are approaching their projects, you need to approach them differently now.
Yeah.
And the customer requests that we're having coming in are ones that they probably are setting up their protocols very differently than they would have considered setting them up a year ago.
Right. Well, now for future studies, right? Yeah. One thing I didn't ask is what does your organization tend to focus in primary therapeutic areas? And I think there's clearly a connection, and Amy, feel free to jump in on this too, that depending on the therapeutic area, right, and the necessity of patients to be coming in to the site in like an oncology study versus a CNS study versus immunology study, right? So I think there's also a very large therapeutic focus difference too on what you can do. Any perspective? And then Amy, feel free to jump in after Chelsea.
Yeah. We focus primarily on oncology and rare diseases.
Okay.
I think oncology, most of the time you need to go on site, right, to get your administration of your IP. And there's a risk benefit analysis there that you have to think about. That population is extremely there's risk more so to them.
Sure, because they're a vulnerable population.
I mean, their immunity is
they are the true population that this quarantine has been really about.
Yeah. So I mean, you really need to consider that, but at the same time, this is a population that they need the therapy now. They really many times cannot wait. So where does that risk benefit analysis put them? So we haven't seen, I don't know that I can say that we've seen our studies stop because, the subject population just doesn't need a therapy right now. So we've been lucky in that regard. It definitely has slowed because sites are not able to schedule people as closely for their assessments because they have to think about waiting rooms and not having
people congregate.
Yeah, just like things like that you maybe at the beginning of this pandemic, people had really great foresight to think about, but there's so many little things that come up daily that are impactful. Yeah. All right, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's both ends of this spectrum, right? You know, in the oncology space, of course, the patients need to continue coming in. They need to continue getting their medicine, and we need to continue to enroll patients because they may not have any other therapy options. In CNS, we are seeing, obviously, a complete different approach where what we're really focusing on is making sure that the patients can continue to get their medicine, but maybe not have to come into the office to get it. So we're doing things like either having the site, we've had some sites actually drive the medication to the patient's home, and maybe skip some of the lab collections like you mentioned, or you know, the vitals collections. One thing that we've had to do is consider, for example, for female patients that are continuing to take their medicine, you know, if they're not coming into the site to get all of their assessments, how do we make sure that we're monitoring that they're not pregnant? And so we've actually gone through the process of shipping pregnancy tests to the site that can be brought to the patient's home. So, and under agreement with the patient that they will kind of monitor themselves on every month, and make sure that they're not pregnant in order to continue taking their medication.
Yeah. Have you had to pivot at all the way that the sites are actually communicating with the patients? I mean, obviously sending them the kits and driving the meds to their homes, but what about kind of the interim kind of checking in on and the interim visit and things like that?
We've seen all different types of things. Our goal has been to try to continue to allow the patients access to the medication. And actually, we've heard from the sites that that's not been the approach of every sponsor. Some sponsors completely stopped their studies or put them on pause. And our sites have given us a lot of recent feedback that they appreciate how much we work with them to try to make sure that the patient can continue on their medication. We've had, you know, so if a patient was coming in for a monthly pill bottle, now we're probably allowing them to take home 3 months worth of drug, for example. And then, you know, we're just going to have to miss some of the assessments that we were expecting to collect.
Yeah.
We've talked though to scale owners and said, you know, are you comfortable with us performing the scale over the phone? Are you comfortable with us performing the scale, you know, not in a face-to-face manner? And we're still collecting some scales that way. We're looking at other options for telehealth and telemedicine visits, as well as to deploy scales, you know, to the patients, but not have to have them take a paper scale home, for example.
Right. So it sounds like right now it's mostly audio. So they're having phone call visits with the subjects, and then where possible, doing oral administration of a licensed clinician administered scale, especially in CNS studies. So that's kind of your model right now.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. What's been the interactions you've had, or you know, one of the questions that kind of came to mind with a lot of these different solutions and technologies and the way we're having to pivot is kind of the receptivity of regulators around making these changes. Just curious to know, you know, what's been the reaction, what has been the you know, the permission, if you will, by regulators to allow kind of some of these. I mean, you know, you read all the time from the different guidances around guidance for COVID and both the MHRA and the EMA and the FDA, and they're all published, right? But I'm just curious to hear from a sponsor's perspective, what you know, is that actually fact, like that these regulators are willing to work with you and kind of making these changes and pivoting? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, absolutely they understand, and we have not encountered any issues with anything that we've proposed. We've been very thoughtful in making sure that we are doing a risk-benefit kind of analysis on an ongoing basis. We have weekly calls with our CRO partners where we, even across different therapeutic areas and different programs, we'll have a weekly call with all of our CRO partners and talk about the current state, maybe where particular sites may be closed, where particular sites may be open, how are we going to manage different aspects of trials, and really share that information across kind of our working group, and not try to streamline those conversations just on a particular protocol or a particular program. We've been really, I think, very thoughtful about, the most important thing is allowing the patients to continue accessing, obviously, their medication and their therapy, and then continue monitoring for safety. And if that means we have to maybe not collect our endpoint data as often, then maybe we'll have to deal with that when it comes time to that.
Yeah. I asked about the regulators ministries of health perspective, but I think the other part that actually came up as a question in the chat was about the IRBees, right, at each of the sites and their willingness to be flexible with you too. I'll talk briefly on it, and then Chelsea, I'd like to get your perspective on that too. But I know from within our organization, right, where we've had customers similar to your story, Amy, about coming to us and saying, hey, I've got these different license scales and assessments that traditionally were being done on site. Can we put them onto a patient's own phone? Can we have them still do it electronically on their own phones? And I will say that the license holders have been very accommodating.
Yes.
I think for obvious reasons, right? They understand the situation. They want to continue to, I'm not saying that money is the driver, but I'm sure that's a big factor in ensuring that these scales can continue to be used. But then also, I think there's been, from what I've seen, a lot of flexibility on the part of the IRBees and others within each of the sites to kind of say, okay, yeah, get us screenshots and things like that that are going to be presented to the patient as quickly as you can, right? We don't want to hold this up because, Amy, to your point, right, we want to make sure they're continuing to receive their meds. We want to make sure that they're still able to participate in the study and not hold that up. So that's what I've been seeing, at least with customers that are kind of changing mid-study in order to keep, not necessarily recruit new patients, right? I think recruitment has definitely taken a dive, but I think those patients that are already recruited, keeping them in the study and being able to collect the data for them, for those that have already been, made it to a certain point in the study, I think has been absolutely critical. I don't, Chelsea, if you have any perspective on some of those topics around both, things you're doing to ensure that patients can continue to, and then your interactions with both IRBees. And I think you may have, again, having both a site perspective as well as kind of a clinical monitoring perspective would be an interesting dynamic.
Yeah. So in general, I would say that our sites and IRBees have been really phenomenal. I think that, just as much as our sponsors want to continue research, the researchers at the sites are just as invested in research. They want to continue it to the best of their ability. So IRBees, I would say, they're definitely having to triage what they can review. So some things are taking longer to review than normal. But I will go back to the FDA guidance that was released in March, and it really reiterates guidance that has always been there, that if there's an imminent risk to someone's safety, then you don't need IRB approval before you make a change to the protocol. And most of our sites understand that, and that investigators understand that. And that's something that we've been reiterating to them, that, the very primary, pillar in research is patient safety. So if at any point you feel that, any part of this protocol is not safe or introducing some more risk to your patient than what they originally had consented to, then we need to reconsider how the protocol is asking you to do these activities right now. So our sites have been great. I think I did see somebody ask a question in the chat about documentation. We've been having to be extremely thorough in our documentation. If there's any protocol deviations that are caused by COVID, all of those, we are detailing out in our protocol deviation logs as the cause being COVID. And the same thing for, our monitoring visits. We're having to do all of our monitoring visits remotely right now. And there are limitations to that. Your sites have been wonderful of making sure that we have the data that we need to keep things moving. But there are definitely delays in getting documentation as quickly as we would if we were just on site. So we need to document that and make sure that there's a paper trail and there's, action items opened so that as soon as we can go back to site, we're able to round out the documentation for the study and not put our sponsors at risk.
Mm-hmm. Well, Amy, if you have anything more to add to that. If not, I have another question, but go ahead.
Well, just in terms of documentation, I mean, I think for us, yes, obviously we're focusing on documenting any kind of protocol deviation. We also document any sort of missed assessment as related to COVID. There is quite a bit of information that's been released by CDISC on how they expect
Mm-hmm.
to be able to see this information reflected in the data sets as you go to submit your data and when you summarize your data in a CSR. And so we're spending quite a bit of time, obviously, making sure that we're collecting the information as much as possible that we're going to need in order to be able to tell that story at the end of the study about what happened with the patients.
Actually, a question through the Q&A that I think is relevant to Amy, something you were saying earlier. One of the statements was that, or questions I should say, was about the administration of patient assessments and scales, that oftentimes they're using trained raters to administer that, especially, even from my own experience, right, in the CNS space, where they're specifically trained on how to administer the Bailey or the brief or whatever CNS related scale there might be. How do you address kind of that aspect? And it needs to, the fact that it needs to be, kind of validated, if you will, for those assessments. Anything around usability testing or any aspects like that that you're kind of grappling with within your?
The ones that I can specifically think about are, CSSRS is administered by a trained rater, but that can be administered, for example, over the phone. So that's how we're kind of managing that for our CNS studies. Other scales, like a PANS or a Madras or anything like that. In general, if we had them set up as a kind of like a tablet collection, we can still continue to do that. The interaction with the patient is just over the phone.
Right.
So, I don't think that we've had that much of an interruption there. It's more of an interruption if you were administering a scale to the patient,
Right.
and using a tablet to do that at the site. I think
Right.
that's
Yeah. And that's honestly what I was more referring to, where, let's
Yeah.
say, again, Amy, you're coming in, meeting with me at the site, and you're completing a patient reported outcome while on site with me. Those are the things that we're pivoting to allow them to do that at home, to give them the ability to do that. I mean, obviously things like, and it's interesting because we're looking at this too, or around different administrations, especially in certain disease states, whether it be in Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis or things like that, where some of the tests that are done are just to see the patient's gait and their dexterity and how well they can work with different things. And so trying to do that remotely obviously presents a challenge. Have you seen any, I know you mentioned about taking study drug, pregnancy tests and other things. Have you seen any push towards like at-home coordinators, coordinators actually going to the patient's homes and conducting an assessment at all there, or either one of you for that matter, but go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, for our studies that we're looking to start in the next year, we're looking at options. And the options that we're looking at employ kind of all of the different functionalities. And we're trying to make sure that we can be flexible to allow whatever a patient may want. So that may be, there may be a patient who prefers to stay at home and have somebody come visit them.
Yep.
There may be a patient who doesn't want somebody coming into their home and doesn't want to go into site. There may be another patient that wants to come into the site every second or third visit. So how do we make our trials or design our trials in such a way that it can fit whatever the patient wants and fit however the patient prefers to interact with.
And you're actually headed right where I was going to go with my question for you, which is what are you doing, within your organization, kind of your sorry, I just want to read like specific. So how are you changing your future trials, like your designs, your schedule of assessments, virtual visit models, hybrid, anything around wearables or passive data, passive sensor collection, anything like where are your heads with that right now within your organization? As much as you can share, obviously, but.
Sure. Yeah, we have a number of studies that we're looking at some wearable options. We have one that we were looking at, even like a home sleep monitoring device, so that they don't have to come in and do a sleep study.
Yeah.
But we're also kind of looking at how can we make sure that we're providing all of these options, and all of these options are equivalent, so that if patient A chooses to do home sleep monitoring and patient B chooses to come into a clinic, how do we make sure that those are equivalent? And that's really what we're looking at. And how do we make sure that this doesn't burden the site, right? And
No,
every
absolutely.
technology that we add, it's something more for the site to worry about.
And
Amy,
speaking of that, go ahead, Chelsea, because I was going to pivot to site
on
questions.
one point there. If a subject were to choose to do an at-home study, would they need to continue that method throughout so that their data alone could be comparable, or are you trying to be flexible to let people change later down the line?
We're trying to be flexible to allow people to change. So we're looking at what technology options are there out there that will allow us to pivot at any point in time, and collect the data either remotely or at the clinic, or through a healthcare provider going to the patient's home, so that whatever we choose to do at a particular point in time can all end up in the data pool together, and really not impact the patient's experience. We want it to really be seamless to the patient.
Right. So one question that just came in, Amy, related to that was, will this flexibility, air quotes, right, cause more variability in the data collection, i.e., for example, a clinical research coordinator visiting the patient's home may collect, in theory, right, more accurate and complete data versus a telehealth, I guess this is all, subjective, right, but versus a telehealth visit collection that the patient essentially took themselves. And again, kind of wearing your data quality hat as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when we're thinking about technologies, what we're trying to do is, so for example, if you need to collect a pulse rate and an O2 stat, right? You can do that using the same monitor, whether it's at the patient's home or at the site, right? You can provide those monitors to the site.
So it's more about consistency of the actual device, right? Whether it's on there or whatever. Okay.
Right.
Sorry.
So
and probably too, Amy, a little bit too, that whatever you're collecting, if it's more of a descriptive thing or if it's just fact, like if that's a reading, then that's just the reading. Do you know what I mean? Instead of, this monitor where we talk about inter-rater reliability, making sure that the way a rater approaches a scale is the same across the board, whether you're doing it at home or doing it in the office. But if you're taking an O2 stat, if you took it correctly, it should just be the O2 stat.
Right. Well, in terms of, rater reliability, obviously, in many of our studies, we try to maintain the same rater across visits, right, for a particular patient. So that means that we need to work with sites that are flexible enough to be able to have a, telephone contact with a patient if they need to, or an in-person visit with a patient if needed, and collect that data in the same manner. I think our sites, what we're hearing from our sites is that they're very interested in kind of moving forward in this way. They obviously want to minimize their own risk and their own, but they want to continue doing good work. And so I think we are hearing from sites that they're very excited about this.
Yeah, I think really the key there is that if you choose to use a certain O2 measurement device, or let's say even a blood pressure cuff, right? That you're using consistent tools across your subjects, right, at a given site.
Correct.
Right? If you're using some type of blood pressure cuff for those patients that are at home, then you really ought not to be, I would assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, right, not be mixing and matching the different collection devices used for that type of vital signs or fill in the blank kind of data, right? You'd want to try.
Depending on how sensitive it is, right?
Right, but I mean, you want to try and stay consistent, I think, to answer the person who asked this question here in the live Q&A. Yeah.
Amy, I'm also curious what you're doing for your EDCs. Are you recording the method of collection and the device within the EDC?
We're recording the method, like the method that the visit is occurring. So we have actually already pivoted and done this in our EDC for our ongoing studies, where on our visit page, for example, we're asking, how was this visit performed? Was it done, in person at the patient's home? Was it done in person on site, or was it done remotely somehow through a telehealth visit? And so that we'll have that information should we need it.
Right, as a reference point for, yeah. And that actually was a question that came in through the Q&A about kind of how are you collecting data for missed assessments due to COVID? Are you typically modifying CRF, direct data capture, EDC to capture these data at the visit page levels? How are you collecting it? So I think, along those lines, right, I think it's documenting whether, because we've had requests to modify existing forms to say, what was the method of collection of this, right? Where were they? Were they in person? Were they at home? What was the location of it? So I think along those lines, that's what that question was hitting at too.
Yeah, I mean, we're not necessarily going through and modifying every assessment page to say assessment not done, reason why. But we are proactively, for not done assessments, we are proactively making sure that there is at least a comment or a query in the database that indicates, why was this not done, and with the COVID response, so that we'll have that in the data.
Yeah.
At the end of the study.
And I think you want to be careful, right, about modifying your eCRFs as well, just to make sure that people don't just skip over it if it's an option to collect that data. And you want to make sure that your CRFs are matching your protocol. If your protocol hasn't changed, then your CRF should collect that data. And like Amy said, what we've been doing is logging protocol deviations with clear information saying it's COVID, and making sure that the sites understand that a protocol deviation, it's not necessarily a slap on the wrist, right? Like you are doing it out of the safety and protection of your subjects and your patients. So just collecting the data and being honest about that collection is important.
Yeah. One question that came in, and again, I don't know about the geographic expansion of the study work that you guys are involved in, but the question was about remote monitoring is not always possible, e.g. in many EU countries. What strategies have you taken to ensure data quality there?
So I can say we do also use like a centralized risk-based monitoring approaches. So where, most of our monitoring visits are not occurring. Monitors are not really being able to go to the sites. They're not able to travel between, even now, they're not able to travel, from state to state like they normally do without quarantining. So we, in particular, have a tool where we are able to not only use KRI indicators, like Chelsea was talking about earlier, where we look at key risk indicators for sites, but we also have a tool where we essentially take all of the clinical trial data, and it is able to perform a statistical test on that data to determine if there's anything that is unusual. So for example, outliers, inliers, is the data too consistent? Is it too variable? And we do that on a quarterly basis, and we've been continuing those efforts to make sure that the data collection methods aren't creating issues in data.
Oh, that's awesome.
And obviously continued audit trail reviews and things like that, that we're able to continue doing.
With regard to the kind of, wearable items, the wearable data, right? The direct from, whether it's a cuff or whether it's pulse ox or whatever it might be. How are you, at least either currently doing or looking to do as far as trying to aggregate, because you're going from finite data points in a typical, direct data capture, eCRF form, right, to millions and millions of data points, right, being collected, within that because of the use of wearables. What are your, how are you thinking about that type of data collection and how best to use it? Would it be certain time points where they're wearing a certain type of, versus like if you're wearing like actigraphy, right, where it's constantly pulling data versus kind of a finite point where they're doing a blood pressure reading, right, and collecting it, sending it up to the cloud or whatever. What are your thoughts around? I mean, I guess a lot depends on the study profile and the therapeutic area too, but.
Yeah, I mean, we don't necessarily use as many wearables as maybe some other sponsors may use, but there's always things like Holter monitoring, right? Where you have to consider, how long does the patient need to have this device on? And then how are we going to manage that continuous data? And what are we going to analyze out of it? Is it going to be averages? Is it going to be at particular points in time, like you said?
Right.
So if somebody's if we're going to give everybody an Apple Watch, I'd like to be part of that study, and monitor their pulse rate or something. How are we going to do that in a way that is kind of meaningful and that we're not just killing ourselves with the amount of data that we're getting? I think you really have to think about that before you employ any kind of wearable.
Okay.
I think too, and just also thinking about when you employ a wearable, the patient burden, right? Like the subject burden of wearing that wearable. Is it something that they have to have on all of the time? And really thinking about, is that something that you would want to be doing all of the time? And is it reasonable to ask them to do? Sometimes too, having to use a device 3 times a day at very specific points in the day, that's pretty restrictive to your patient population. So just keeping that in mind too, I think is important from a sponsor perspective of what's happening to the last person using it on the project.
So from a CRO perspective, Chelsea, kind of build on that. What are some of the things you're hearing about, both in terms of future study design and kind of how your customers are looking to pivot in light of COVID? I mean, obviously, like you said, you haven't seen a tremendous amount kind of mid-study, but what are you seeing in the kind of the potential projects coming into you now that you guys are bidding on?
Sure. So, I mean, we've looked at many different vendors, right? So you talked about earlier videography, videoing patient gait, or videoing a certain assessment that's required for a protocol. And we've talked to vendors that actually have trained raters to go and do them in the patient home, rather than thinking that all your sites will be able to do that. Many sites don't have the staff to send people to patient homes, so you have to think about how you can provide that to them as a sponsor. We've also, going back to the monitoring, we've talked to vendors for creating virtual monitoring visits where you actually wear a set of glasses and you walk through and can see the site, and it's like you're there. And that's all recorded. We've talked to, wearables, ePro, eCOA, and I think as much as you can think about not introducing something new to someone's life, but using something that they already have in their daily function is key. So an ePro, if you can do an ePro using their phone instead of giving them a new tablet to have at home, that's something that's way more likely to happen for that subject, right?
Yeah.
Or if you can think about how they have their daily life, how you can integrate something that you're asking them to do into their normal schedule, there's way more likely to be a compliance there. So our clients are coming to us with those type of questions.
Great. Well, believe it or not, it is now 8:53 a.m. East Coast time. I know Chris had asked us to kind of try and stop around 5 just to allow for our participants the ability to get ready for their next meetings. The nice thing is I've really been trying to weave in every question that's come in through the chat panel. So thankfully, we've been able to take both some of the things that we had talked about prior, but as well as take some of the questions that came in from the panelists, from the participants. I think, just to kind of wrap things up, and I'll let each of you kind of give a 30-second closing remark as well. I mean, again, thanks very much for joining us here this morning. I know from my perspective, it's certainly near and dear to my heart. I tried not, as a technology vendors, to let you guys talk more about kind of what you're seeing. But certainly, I think, as we look at this, it's, I think, creativity, but also tempered with, like Amy was talking about, making sure that you have quality checks and balances and that you're monitoring data and ensuring kind of integrity and consistency across all the things that you're doing. I think embracing technologies is important, especially in light of ensuring that you can recruit, enroll, and especially retain, but you need to do so in a way that's going to be, it's going to pass the sniff test, if you will, of regulators. And I think, what each of you have talked about as far as documenting things and ensuring that you have well orchestrated plans, I think is really important in all of this, but it's absolutely doable. It's just, may take a little kind of a change of thinking about how you go about doing that. Amy, any last thoughts here?
Yeah, I would say, my organization, and part of the reason why I've stayed so long at my organization is that we are very risk tolerant, and we are interested in trying new things. And so using this as an opportunity to understand what are the technologies out there that can enhance your trials, and how can you build that in. We're looking at that more so now than ever. But we always did. And so, but I think for anybody to be successful, obviously post this pandemic, you're going to have to change the way you do business and really make sure that you're being able to adapt to what a patient may need without obviously creating additional burden at the site.
Great, thank you. And Chelsea, take us home.
I just think this has been a really great panel, and I enjoyed this conversation a lot this morning. I think, Permetrica as a company, we've always approached our sponsors as extensions to our company. We're extensions to theirs. We're partners. And I think in this pandemic, it's more important than ever to really lean on one another and lean on your sites and get that information that you need to make the studies more efficient. Make sure that you're really considering your patient population and making sure that you're not putting more of a burden on the sites than they're already experiencing.
And I think in forums like this, right, for those of you that are participating, I know, both Amy and myself and Chelsea certainly willing to, to share any further thoughts that we have around things. The reason why I'm switching to slides is because, here's email addresses as well. This is being recorded. But feel free, hopefully I speak for both Amy and Chelsea today. If you have any questions about anything that you're struggling with within your current or future studies, I'm sure all of us would be more than happy to share perspectives and recommendations too. So with that, I turn it back to Chris and the MassBio team, and thank you again, Chris and company, for facilitating this. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Great, valuable discussion. And the recording will be up on our MassBio YouTube channel, so you can just Google MassBio on YouTube, and it'll be up in about a day. Thanks again, panelists, for your time.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Have a good day.
You too.